Really thrilled today to be joined by an excellent member of Congress. It's lazy to say that all of Congress is rotten. That's a cynical way to look at it. There are some exemplary members of Congress that you can trust, that tell you the truth, that are smart, and in fact, are precisely the type of people by personality, disposition, temperament, experience, judgment, probity, and wisdom that you want sitting in a chamber of 435 members in a nation of 330 million people doing the nation's business. There are not enough serious people in the United States Congress, but that's not an issue with the person we're lucky enough to be joined by today. Congressman Dan Goldman, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Very nice introduction, and appreciate you saying all that.
So when I think about what's happening in this moment, the word that pops across my frontal lobe is careening towards an unnecessary economic crisis, default. And I wanted to ask you, sitting there, what does it look like from Washington? What is it that you are witnessing, seeing? How can you explain it to people that are out there trying to get a handle on what's happening, and explain, if you would, how much worse and more dire this is going to get day by day as the line gets closer and closer to a national default?
Yeah, I think it is one of the difficult things about this situation is it's hard to explain in 30-second sound bites as you might get on cable news television, which is why a podcast like this actually is the right forum, because essentially we have committed to spending in the past, or spending and cuts in the past. In every administration, every law, there's a financial cost to it that ultimately has to be paid for. And the way that the United States pays for it is we essentially sell our bonds in our own treasury bonds, which are very common. And we issue those bonds to other countries or other individuals. And we end up having to pay interest on those bonds. That accrues over time, and that ultimately can, if we do not generate as much tax revenue or other revenues, ultimately lead to a deficit. And so we have a very high deficit of around $31 trillion. That is a result of many things, including legislation, decades ago, including recent legislation, and including tax cuts and other types of revenue cutting legislation, including the 2017 Trump tax cuts that increased our deficit by $2 trillion and gave the benefits, 87% of the benefits, to the wealthiest 1%. So this has accrued over time. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, Congress passed a law saying that in order to increase our debt ceiling so that we can pay our debts, we need a bill, we need a law that allows us to do that. And over time, we have had to consistently do that as our deficit has gotten bigger. And more recently, as inflation has risen, more interest rates have gone up. And so our debt costs more to pay. And what ultimately is going on right now is that we need to lift our debt ceiling in order to pay our past debts. It has nothing to do with future spending. It has nothing to do with future revenue, with cuts, or whatever we decide we're going to do next year or the year after. Everything related to the debt ceiling is retrospective. We're looking backwards and we're paying things we've already committed to. During the Trump administration, Congress raised the debt ceiling without any preconditions 3 times in order to pay the debts, including on those tax cuts, which were the most significant driver of the deficit during the Trump administration. So now we are up against that debt ceiling, and we need to pass another law that increases the debt ceiling from the $31.4 trillion where it is in order to continue to pay our debts. This is not the normal budget process. This is not when we do our appropriations process and spending. But what the House Republicans are doing is they are making their agreement to raise our debt limit contingent on spending cuts in a wide variety of areas and in undoing some of the past legislation. Now, this is out and out extortion, because they would never, ever be able to pass any of the things they are demanding right now through in the regular order of congressional business, the regular budgetary process. It would never get through the Senate, and it would never get signed by the president. But what they are doing is they are holding out on the essential need to raise our debt ceiling so we can pay our past debts, in order to hold the American people hostage, and potentially lead to calamitous financial ruin.
I want to key off a couple of words that you used that I don't think you used lightly, being that you were a federal prosecutor who prosecuted Genovese family mobsters amongst others. Extortion, hostage, right? That this is an act of extortion. That's how you see it.
I do, and
the country is being taken hostage by this, and I agree with it. I want to talk about a concept very quickly here, which is these words: the full faith and credit of the United States of America, and what that means. Now, every leader or set of leaders from the beginning of the country across both political parties has had a basic understanding of the concept that even if they were deficit and debt spenders, and certainly all of our recent presidents have been up until Trump, and then Trump's spending was next level that they're threatening to default on. But the idea that you would not pay the payments on the debt is an extraordinary departure from history in this country.
You're exactly right, Steve. And we saw in 2011, the Republicans used the same playbook against President Obama. And what happened was, even before we reached the point of default, our bond ratings went down. Now, the United States Treasury and bonds in the United States government are traditionally considered to be the most reliable investment that anyone in the world can make. And our entire economy is predicated on that full faith and credit in our Treasury Department. And in knowing, and everyone around the world knowing, that the U.S. is the economic leader around the world, our bonds are as pristine and prime as any in the world. And that has a massive sprawling effect on the global economy. When Moody's reduced the rating of our bonds in 2011, there was a shock wave through the economy. And that was before we even defaulted. The ruin that will come if we default on our debts will have tremendous consequence. There are estimates, independent estimates, that 8 million Americans will lose their jobs. We will not be able to pay our debts, which will raise interest rates, so raise loan rates, raise all sorts of rates, make everything much more expensive. It will devastate a lot of businesses that operate on debt. It will have a catastrophic impact on not only the U.S. economy, but the global economy, because so much is spent on that. And the Republicans know that. And they know that the impact of this will be devastating. And Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida said the quiet part out loud yesterday to the media. And when he said, why would we negotiate with our hostage? So this is not just me saying that they are holding the American people hostage by way of the Democrats and the president. This is them saying that because they know that Democrats generally will make sure that this calamitous ruin of an economic default on our debts does not happen. And they believe that President Biden will cave because he does not want that to happen to the American people. They take no responsibility for their role in not only increasing our deficit and causing all these debts, but in the requirement and the duty that they have to pay those debts.
Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you never miss a video. Also, for more content just like this, please consider joining our Warning Premium community. You can find out more in the description below. So let me just be clear and align myself in total agreement with you that, you know, this issue is an appalling act of reckless, irresponsible political conduct by an extremist House Republican majority that is ransoming the economic prosperity of the nation for a hobby project that is deeply, deeply hypocritical when you look at the fact that there were no objections against the $8 trillion of Trump debt and across 3 increases of the debt ceiling. Now, I want to talk about the politics of this and ask you if you're frustrated at all. And so at the beginning of the conversation, let me say, when I think back over my political career in the White House, you know, as a senior aide to leadership in Congress, to a California governor, you know, other jobs, I've always proceeded from a point of view that language is important. And so never means never. And sometimes means sometimes, and you need to draw a line. Now, I remember coming to California, where I first met Kevin McCarthy in very early 2006. I left the White House to take over Arnold Schwarzenegger's campaign. And it wasn't as if Congress was at a high water mark in early 2006, but I distinctly remember, and a lot of these guys are now in Congress from California, but they were all in the legislature. Tom McClintock, being another one. I remember going to my first caucus meeting. I said, I said, these guys make the Congress look like Churchill's war cabinet. It was just unbelievable, right? So watching Kevin McCarthy over many years, this is somebody who just 2 weeks ago, Joe Biden said, I think Kevin McCarthy is an honorable guy that you can negotiate in good faith with. I think that's absurd on its face. But secondarily, to that, President said, and the Democratic position was, we will not negotiate on this issue. We will not link it to cuts in future spending. We will not let you ransom the country. And there you have Kevin McCarthy now sitting in the Oval Office opposite the president in the opposing head of state chair, right? One of the most exalted pictures, right, that you can have in terms of, you know, you want a picture that Kevin McCarthy is going to hang on his wall and exalt himself in and, you know, raise his stature and image. It's that picture. So now, right, the American people care about spending. Your moderate Republicans, such that there are in the actual country, not in the Congress, are the most fiscally conservative people in the room. The debt at $32 trillion is something that a lot of us are concerned about, believe that both parties are big spending parties, are sympathetic to we have to cut spending. This is a runaway train. And now Kevin McCarthy, of all people, has snookered the president into a direct negotiation on this and is actually on the right side of the cut issue. Are you worried about an unfolding political disaster here as we come into the summer, that the White House has lost control of the political argument, that it's a mistake to have open direct negotiations and come off that line with the White House. And I'll just say, I'm very worried about it. And over my dead body, right, if I was sitting there in the White House in the chief of staff's office, would I have, signed off on these negotiations, going forward? It's a terrible, terrible idea in my book.
I hear you. I do think that I think part of the problem that you're recognizing is once you open up the gate to negotiations, there's not an obvious endpoint. And what I think you have hit the nail on the head about is one of the problems that we've run into with this Donald Trump controlled Republican Party is we no longer can have faith that our leaders actually care about the interests of the country as opposed to their own personal interests. And no matter what you want to say about George W. Bush, and I disagreed with many of his policies, I never once questioned his fidelity to the Constitution and his fidelity to our country. Now, maybe, some of the interrogation tactics, we can disagree on some of that issues, but he was doing that, whatever he was doing, in furtherance of the country's interests. And so that is the Republican Party that President Biden knows. And I think he is desperately hoping that there are some remnants of that Republican Party left. I've not seen it in this House Republican leader.
I want to stop you there and ask you about that. And I do think that you are precisely correct in analyzing that. And I think it is not a lonely view amongst many members of Congress, many people in Washington, D.C. And I guess the question I would ask is, what do you attribute it to after 8 years? And Trump has really now been on the national stage with the birther nonsense and everything else for a decade. What more does anybody need to see to understand that these people mean exactly what it is that they say they mean? What do you think the disconnect is?
So this is something I've thought a lot about because the influence that Donald Trump continues to have over the Republican Party is shocking to me. Now, I led the first impeachment investigation, and it was, I think, pretty clear from what we demonstrated and proved that he abused the power of his office to use his official authority for his personal gain. But what he did in withholding $400 million of military assistance at that time seems quaint compared to what he has done since. And when you see what he has done post-2020 election, trying to overturn the election, inciting a violent insurrection, and you still have so many members of his party and the leadership and control of the House Republicans who are still kissing his ring, it is shocking. So you ask yourself why. I think there are a lot of smart people who have a lot of reasons. My brief take on it is that Donald Trump expanded the base of the party to a number of voters who were disengaged, who were not voters, who were not part of this process. And they only got engaged in the political process because of him. And they are unbreakable in their support of him. That base has, I think, expanded a little bit as the rest of the Republican Party has shrunk. So it is now a disproportionate amount of the base of the Republican Party. And there is simply a cult following of Donald Trump from those people and others that they have infected. And so even if ultimately he only has, support from 25 or 30% of the Republican Party, and I think it's probably more than that at this point, he remains, that's about all you need to win a large, a multi-candidate primary. And so he continues to have control because of the following that he has and the threats that he uses as a wannabe mob boss to threaten to primary anyone who goes against him, to threaten to support anyone who doesn't agree, to support anyone opposing someone who doesn't agree with him. And essentially, he is, in true, Republican fashion, holding the House Republicans hostage to his whims. And that's why there's such an outsized influence, because I have conversations with people in Congress behind the scenes quietly. They can't stand him. And they think he's terrible for the party, but they would never speak out because they are concerned about their own political future. And we have seen many times that when you stand up to Donald Trump, if you're in the Republican Party, he will come after you with a far-right extremist primary. And in many cases, he wins. Now, in the Senate, he didn't win last time. And in some of the, but in the House, he did pretty well. And so that is a threat that looms, and any rational person who's just focused on their reelection is just not going to entertain that kind of discourse with him.
How do you feel about the fact that you'll read blind quotes from White House political advisors basically saying, we want Trump. We want Trump through the Republican primary to be the nominee, which really means bringing Trump into the finals. He's one of the major party nominees on the ballot and in position to win an election against someone at the end of the day who will be 82 years old and has an approval level that ranges from high 30s to mid 40s. When I read that, it brings me to the edge of an aneurysm. I can't. It's so reckless that there's not a word for it. And at the same time, I was talking to a group of Democratic friends of mine, all work in politics. I'm the only former Republican in the room. I was trying to bring up the case is that there's only really two teams in the league, right? If there were 15 teams and Donald Trump and his MAGA coalition were crushing everybody, that says something. But if there's only two teams, and that's the team that you're losing to in this race, that race, it says something. Do you understand what the appeal is? What drives that Trump voter? Do you get the 40% of the country that doesn't have $400 cash available, that's looking to deliver a you to somebody? And that's what I think Trump is at the end of the day. He's the lowest conceivable bar that's ever been, because the only expectation that people have of the guy, of his supporters, is that he's going to say you to someone for them. But do you understand or have a theory on why so many people want that fuck you delivered? And I think that's exactly what it is. I'm not trying to be gratuitous with the language. There is a seething anger, certainly stoked by a $1 billion rage and anger industry, but the anger is real. No matter how it's come to be, how justified it is. And so I wanted to ask you about that and really hear what you think about as a political leader, is someone that I look at with tremendous promise as a political leader. What are we going to do about that?
Well, you raised two very important issues. And just to address the first part of what you said, because I think this is really important to discuss. I don't think there's any question that Joe Biden's best chance of winning the next election is against Donald Trump. And I think it would be horrible for the country for Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee. We need to stamp out this authoritarian, anti-democratic demagogue and
Amen.
get back to focusing on conversations that are about the country's interest. And that is not what Donald Trump is. And so I am willing to accept that my party has less of a chance to be in the White House in order to make sure that someone as corrupt, as both morally and otherwise, someone as narcissistic and focused exclusively on himself, someone who has turned upside down our foreign policy and our broader approach to democracy, should not be able to reach anyone in this country. Because even if he loses, his rhetoric, his views still are in the blood system of this country, and we need to eliminate that. Someone once said to me, and I think this is a good choice, would you want Adolf Hitler on the ballot if that meant that you had a better chance of winning? No, because the chance that he would become the president is too great a risk, whatever it is. To your second point, this is something that we Democrats need to do a lot more meaningful analysis, because I don't think it's as simple as just saying the Trump supporters just don't know what they're doing. That's not fair. That's not respectful. And that I don't think that's helpful. I think the reality is that there are a lot of people in this country who have felt like, and this has increased over time, that the government does not work for them. Government works for either themselves or the elite, so to speak, and that they're not at the table for the conversations, that people don't care about them. People are not identifying or interested in what matters to them. And then there's also this feeling among many in our country where they're feeling like they are getting overtaken by external forces that they can't control. And what I think Donald Trump has done very successfully is he's tapped into that disengagement and that disillusionment. And he's provided people with something very different to see as part of our government, and a frankness and candor that many might find repulsive and inappropriate, but speaks to, I think, a general view that, we ought to be able to speak our mind a little bit more, and that he represents someone who, as you point out, will stand up to the establishment, is not going to cave to special interests, or is not just interested in those around him. Somehow he has, even though I think he is, but he has convinced people through his populism that he is there for him. And I think there are examples of this throughout history, and one that is really worth focusing on is that there was previously an America First movement in the United States.
Sure was.
In the 1930s. And it has eerie similarities to what is going on right now. They actually were able to infiltrate Congress. And I think Rachel Maddow's podcast on this called Ultra really was fantastic. But this is a authoritarian playbook that he is running. And it can be, and historically has been very effective. And part of what we need to do is we need to reach out to many of these disillusioned folks and talk about policies, ideas, understand what their concerns are, and directly address them. And that's something that we have talked a lot about here in Congress.
I wanted to ask you real quickly about George Santos, fellow New York member of Congress. What is the reaction to his presence in the chamber. I imagine, knowing your background, that seeing him must raise your blood pressure significantly, to say the least. And I'm curious, behind the scenes, what do people say about him? What do your Republican colleagues say about him? Are they ashamed? Are they embarrassed? Are they disgusted? What is the hesitation to expel the guy? Is it the collapse of any standard whatsoever in this era? What?
Yeah, exactly what I said. Power is all that matters to this Republican Party. It is the only thing that matters. And when you see them willing to protect George Santos in order to preserve an extra Republican vote in a very narrow majority that they have, it tells you everything you need to know. This is a guy who not only lied about his resume, his background, his employment, his a variety of things, and now has been charged for lying on his campaign finance disclosures. And I think there will be more that comes out about his campaign finances that is ripe for criminal prosecution. But he used lies about 9/11, about the Holocaust, about the Pulse nightclub shooting, which is the worst LGBTQ mass shooting in our history. He is a depraved individual who literally took three of the most tragic events in the last 100 years and used them lied about them for his personal benefit so he could deceive his voters and get into Congress and walk the halls. And it is, whether it's criminal or not, it is despicable and depraved. And it burns me up as someone who does really care about restoring the integrity to Congress and the reputation of Congress, because we do need to get back to being a body that focuses on the people rather than on the individuals who may be here or our special interests and supporters. And George Santos walking the same halls that I walk and voting on the same bills that I walk it offends me. And I will say this, and this is what is the disconnect. The Republicans I speak to, I think they are ashamed that George Santos is there. The problem is their shame is not enough to motivate them to do anything. And that is the disconnect. Many of my Republican colleagues, routinely make jokes about, George Santos was the first one who arrived on the moon, or, all sorts of mocking of his ridiculous lies. But they're embarrassed, but they're just not going to do anything because power is more important.
Perfect spot to leave it. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Thanks, Steve. Really good to see you.